Out where the land burns quiet under the weight of the sun and trust is harder to find than water, there lived a man named Amos Clay. He wasn't a sheriff, nor a rancher of great repute. He had a modest home near the edge of a forgotten trail and a habit of doing good without waiting for thanks. Folks called him soft, said he'd never survive long with that kind of heart. But Amos never cared what they thought. Not when he saw a man on the edge of collapse, barefoot, silent, and shaking from hunger, limping down the ridge with dust in his eyes and no name on his lips. Most would have looked away. Some might have called the law. In a land where identity was tied to safety, a nameless man was seen as a threat. But Amos didn't ask questions. He opened his door, cut a piece of bread from his last loaf, and handed it to the stranger with both hands. The man didn't speak, didn't stay. He took the bread, bowed once with tears in his eyes, and disappeared into the dusk like a shadow. The town mocked Amos the next day. Feeding ghosts now, they laughed. But Amos just smiled and went back to tending his small piece of earth. Weeks passed. The man was forgotten. The trail grew colder. But on the 30th morning, when the mist still clung to the field and the crows hadn't yet begun to sing, the sound of hoofbeats broke across the horizon like a wave. 200 soldiers crested the hill in full armor, their banners snapping in the wind. They didn't speak. They didn't threaten. They simply encircled Amos Clay's home, not as invaders, but as guardians. One dismounted and placed a sealed letter in Amos's calloused hand. It read, "You fed the son of the throne. Now, the throne feeds you." The town fell into stunned silence. The same people who once scoffed now stared, open-mouthed, as royal tents were pitched and firewood stacked by the dozen. Amos said nothing. He didn't seek fame, didn't chase reward. But in the kingdom's eyes, his simple gift of bread had been greater than any treaty or tax. In a world obsessed with titles, one man with no crown had honored the crown itself, through kindness alone. This is the story of how one loaf of bread, shared with a stranger, turned an ordinary man into the most protected soul in the West. And how, sometimes, the smallest act of mercy carries a power even kings can't ignore. Stay with us, because what happened next will remind you why doing good, even when no one is watching, might just change everything. Amos Clay was a man shaped by hardship, but softened by the land's unforgiving beauty. His house sat near the cracked banks of a shallow creek, surrounded by sagebrush and wildflowers that stubbornly clung to life in the desert. He wasn't rich by any measure. His hands bore calluses from years of toil, and his eyes reflected countless sunsets watched alone. Yet, Amos held a secret strength, a kindness forged not from wealth or power, but from the deep understanding that every soul deserved bread, no matter how forgotten. The day the nameless man appeared was one like many others, hot, silent, and endless. Amos was chopping wood when the figure staggered over the ridge. Clothes torn, face covered in dust and shadows, the stranger moved like a ghost between the rocks. Without hesitation, Amos set down his axe, stepped inside his humble home, and tore a piece from his last loaf of bread. He didn't ask for a name, a story, or a reason. He only handed the bread across his threshold, a simple act that carried more weight than the rifles of many men. That night, the stranger disappeared, vanishing into the horizon as silently as he'd come. The townsfolk whispered rumors that the man was an outlaw, a fugitive, or worse. They warned Amos to be careful, to keep his doors shut and his bread close. But Amos only shook his head. He had learned that in a world ruled by suspicion and fear, a single act of trust was a revolution. He went about his days quietly, feeding chickens and repairing fences, unaware that the seed he'd planted would soon bloom beyond imagination. News came in the form of riders on horses stamped with the royal insignia. 200 soldiers, armored and alert, rode into town, their arrival a thunderous surprise. They camped on Amos's land, their boots imprinting new stories into the dust. Their captain delivered a letter wrapped in silk and sealed with wax, an invitation and a warning. Amos was to come with them. The entire town held its breath. The man who had once been mocked now found himself at the center of a story far bigger than any of them had dreamed. As Amos mounted a horse provided by the soldiers, he looked back at his home, the place that had seen his greatest solitude and his boldest generosity. He understood then that the bread he had given was more than sustenance. It was a lifeline stretched across kingdoms, a bond between strangers that even kings respected. And as the soldiers rode into the horizon, Amos rode with them, not as a prisoner, but as a man who had unknowingly rewritten his own destiny. The journey to the king's court was unlike anything Amos had ever experienced. Vast landscapes rolled past his window, mountains kissed by snow, rivers shimmering in the sunlight, towns bustling with life and color. His escort was respectful but watchful, as if guarding a treasure far greater than gold. Amos kept silent, his mind racing with questions. Who was the man he had fed? Why had the king sent so many soldiers? What did this all mean for a man who had lived most of his days alone? When they reached the palace gates, Amos felt a weight heavier than any saddle in his chest. The grand hall shimmered with chandeliers, and tapestries told stories older than any town he had known. The king himself, regal and imposing, awaited him, a man of great age but sharp eyes. Without ceremony, the king spoke of his son, the nameless man Amos had saved, who was no stranger but the heir to the throne, lost and presumed dead. The bread Amos had given had saved a life that was tied to the fate of an entire kingdom. The king's gratitude was profound but unadorned. Instead of riches, he offered protection, 200 soldiers stationed not just to guard Amos, but to honor him. His simple home, once vulnerable, became a fortress watched over by the finest guards. Amos's neighbors watched in awe as soldiers patrolled streets they once called dangerous. The town shifted beneath his feet, transforming from forgotten outpost to center of a king's favor. And yet Amos remained humble, never asking for more than he needed, never forgetting the dust and silence of his past. In the quiet moments between the formalities, Amos walked the palace gardens alone. He pondered the strange twists of fate that had brought him here, a man with no name, protected by soldiers because he gave bread without expecting anything. He thought of the man he had fed, the mystery that had changed everything with a single act of kindness. And he realized that in a world full of guns and greed, sometimes the most powerful weapon was mercy. The king's soldiers stayed, but Amos never let them change who he was. He still worked the land when he could, still shared bread with those who came to his door. His story spread far beyond the palace walls, a story that whispered through the west like a promise. Sometimes, the smallest gesture, given without hesitation, is enough to rewrite a life. And that life can ripple out to change the world. Back in Red Hollow, the arrival of the king's soldiers marked the beginning of a new era. The townsfolk, once skeptical of Amos's quiet ways, now watched with a mix of wonder and respect as their modest community transformed overnight. Streets were patrolled, homes guarded, and the air filled with a strange sense of safety. But Amos never let the power shift his heart. He remained the same man who fed a stranger without asking a name, who shared what little he had simply because it was right. Neighbors came to him, curious and cautious, seeking answers that Amos couldn't fully give. How did a simple loaf of bread summon an army? Why did a king care for a nameless man? Amos would smile softly, his eyes reflecting the dust of the plains. Sometimes, he said, it's not about who we are, but what we do when it matters most. And in those words, the town found a new kind of pride, one not born of wealth or titles, but of courage and compassion. As days turned to weeks, Amos's home became a symbol, not of royal favor, but of the power of kindness. Travelers passing through would stop to leave gifts, a sack of flour, a bundle of firewood, a jar of honey. They whispered the story of the man who gave bread to a stranger, who was then protected by soldiers sent by a king. It was a story that spread beyond borders and deserts, reminding people that in the harshest places, humanity could still prevail. One evening, under a sky scattered with stars, Amos stood at the edge of his property, watching the campfires of the soldiers flicker in the darkness. He thought of the nameless man, the prince who had once been lost to the desert, and felt a quiet hope. That single loaf of bread had become more than sustenance. It was a bridge between worlds, a testament to the idea that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and that sometimes the smallest gift carries the greatest weight. Though protected by an army, Amos never forgot the desert winds or the dust under his boots. He remained a man of the West, humble, steady, and generous. And, as the soldiers stood watch over his home, the real watchmen were the countless people inspired by his story. Because in every corner of the West, there were men and women quietly choosing to give their last piece of bread, knowing that kindness could move even kings. The king's soldiers did more than guard Amos's home. They guarded a message. They were a living testament that even those who seem insignificant can be woven into the fabric of great things. This protection sent ripples through neighboring towns and territories, where whispers of Amos's generosity stirred something long buried, the belief that honor wasn't reserved for the powerful, but earned by the humble. Boone's story, passed from lips to eager ears, became a lesson taught around campfires and in dusty saloons. It reminded weary travelers that every soul deserves compassion, that every gesture of kindness is a thread in a much larger tapestry. People began to see their own struggles reflected in Amos's simple act of giving. They understood that heroism often comes wrapped in silence, and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought with open hands instead of guns. In the weeks that followed, Amos received visitors from all walks of life. Some sought to offer thanks, others sought wisdom, and a few came simply to witness the man behind the legend. To them, Amos remained unchanged, the same quiet figure who greeted every guest with the warmth of a hearth fire and the generosity of a last loaf shared. He spoke little but lived loudly through his actions, reminding everyone that true strength is measured by what we give away, not what we keep. The soldiers, too, grew fond of their charge. They respected his humility and found themselves learning from his example. His presence softened even the hardest hearts among them. Some soldiers began volunteering in the town, helping neighbors, sharing meals, and spreading the quiet revolution of kindness that Amos had started. It was as if the king's protection was not only for Amos, but for an ideal, one that demanded courage, sacrifice, and unwavering compassion. And through it all, Amos never sought the spotlight. He remained grounded in the simple truth that had carried him this far. Kindness offered freely, without expectation, is the greatest legacy one can leave. The protection of 200 soldiers was not the end of his story. It was a new beginning, a powerful reminder that even the smallest gifts can command the highest honor. As the town settled into its new reality under the king's watchful eyes, Amos began to notice subtle changes, not in himself, but in those around him. The fear that once gripped the hearts of Red Hollow's people loosened its hold. With soldiers guarding the streets, children played with a newfound freedom, and neighbors shared stories by evening fires without suspicion. But the true transformation was quieter. It lived in the way kindness spread like wildfire, igniting even the coldest souls to acts of unexpected generosity. Amos made it a habit to walk through the town at dawn, greeting those stirring awake. He'd visit the blacksmith and quietly fix a worn tool. He'd help the widow gather firewood or carry a basket of eggs to the orphanage. None of these acts were grand or announced. They were simply part of who he was. And in these small moments, the true power of his gift became clear. It was not the soldiers that protected the town, but the community he inspired to protect one another. Stories of Amos and his bread traveled beyond Red Hollow's dusty borders. A merchant in a distant city spoke of a man who gave his last loaf to a stranger and received a king's favor in return. A preacher in a mountain settlement told his congregation about the strength found in humble mercy. Letters arrived, gifts came, sometimes seeds to plant, sometimes tools to share, all gestures that bound strangers into a growing family of kindness. Amos's simple bread had sparked a chain reaction of grace reaching far beyond the desert. Yet Amos remained restless. The desert's call was deep within him, a reminder of the journeys still left to travel. Even with 200 soldiers standing guard, he never saw his home as a fortress, but as a waypoint. One evening, under a sky blazing with stars, he told the captain of the guard, "Protection is not what I need most. I need to remember what it means to give when you have nothing left." The captain nodded, understanding that Amos's heart was tethered not by walls, but by the endless horizon. As the sun rose the next day, Amos prepared to leave Red Hollow for a time, carrying with him the blessings of a town forever changed. The soldiers watched silently, their respect unspoken but deeply felt. And in the echoes of his footsteps across the dirt road, the message was clear: greatness is not given, it's earned, one loaf of bread, one act of kindness at a time. Word of Amos's departure spread quickly, and soon visitors began arriving. Not soldiers or nobles, but everyday people seeking to walk in the footsteps of the man who had fed a stranger and earned a king's protection. They came with open hearts, curious minds, and hands ready to give. The town embraced them, sharing not only shelter but stories of how a single loaf of bread could change lives, and how mercy held the power to reshape destinies. Amos traveled light, but he carried a heavy burden, the weight of expectations and the memory of that nameless man's grateful eyes. His journey took him across rugged trails, through sun-baked valleys and shadowed canyons, always searching for those forgotten by the world. He gave food, water, and hope, never asking for a name or a thanks, knowing that sometimes the truest kindness is the kind that asks for nothing in return. On one occasion, Amos found himself in a small village besieged by hunger and fear. The people had locked themselves away, distrustful of strangers. But when Amos shared his bread with a hungry child and listened to the silent pleas of a weary mother, walls began to crumble. Not just the wooden ones, but the ones built inside hearts. Soon, neighbors began opening doors, sharing what little they had, and the village found a flicker of light in the darkest of times. Throughout his travels, Amos encountered skeptics and cynics who doubted the power of such simple acts. But each encounter was met not with argument, but with action. A loaf shared at a crossroads, a hand extended to lift a fallen rider, a quiet prayer whispered in the wind. These were the weapons of Amos's fight against a world often too harsh to notice. And with every person touched, the legacy of the man with no name grew stronger, more real. As months turned to years, Amos's story became a whispered legend, told by campfires and passed from one dusty town to the next. It was a tale of quiet courage, a testament to the idea that sometimes the smallest gifts, like bread shared without question, carry the heaviest weight. And through it all, Amos remained humble, a man who knew that true greatness was not in recognition, but in the grace to give when no one else would. Years passed, and Amos's story became woven into the fabric of the West like the rugged trails and dusty sunsets. Towns far and wide told the tale of the man who fed a nameless stranger and earned the protection of a king's soldiers. But more than legend, his story became a call to action, a reminder that greatness is not reserved for the crowned or the wealthy, but belongs to anyone willing to offer kindness without expectation. In Red Hollow, a tradition grew. Every month, on the day the soldiers had arrived, the townsfolk gathered to share bread and stories. Children sat wide-eyed, learning how a single loaf had altered the fate of a man and a kingdom. Elders recounted how Amos's humility had softened the hardest hearts. The act of sharing food became a sacred ritual, a quiet revolution that bonded a community through generosity and grace. Travelers who passed through Red Hollow often stayed longer than planned, drawn by the warmth of a town transformed by one man's compassion. Many left carrying seeds of Amos's legacy to their own homes, planting gardens of kindness in places once barren. His story taught them that every stranger could be a brother, every loaf of bread a bridge. And through these simple truths, the spirit of Amos Clay spread across the West like wildfire, igniting hope where it was needed most. Despite the soldiers' protection, Amos remained ever the humble man of the land. He tended his garden, mended fences, and shared meals with neighbors, never letting the grandeur of his unexpected honor cloud the simple joy of giving. His true strength lay not in royal favor or armed guards, but in the endless well of generosity he drew from his own heart, a heart shaped by hardship but tempered by grace. As the sun set on another day in Red Hollow, Amos often stood on the porch of his home, gazing toward the horizon where the dust met the sky. He knew that his story was far from over. With every act of kindness inspired by his own, the legacy he had begun would carry on, a timeless testament that in the harshest lands, Even the smallest gift can command the greatest respect. One evening, as a crimson sunset bled across the sky, a messenger arrived from the king's court, wrapped in fine cloth and bearing a seal of royal gold. The message was simple. The king himself wished to meet the man who had given so much without asking for anything. Amos, though hesitant, accepted the summons, understanding that this meeting was less about him and more about the power of the story he represented. At the palace, the king greeted Amos with a solemn nod. "Your gift saved my son," he said, "but it has done something greater. It has reminded me and my kingdom that power is nothing without mercy." The king presented Amos with a humble token, a simple pendant shaped like a loaf of bread, symbolizing the strength found in generosity. Yet the true gift was the king's vow to protect not just Amos, but all those who live by the quiet code of kindness. The meeting was not just a ceremony. It was a call to a kingdom to embrace compassion in a time rife with conflict and greed. Amos's story, carried in that pendant and the hearts of those who heard it, became a beacon. It traveled with merchants, soldiers, and wanderers alike, spreading the idea that a kingdom's true strength lies in the hearts of its people, especially those who give without thought for reward. Returning home, Amos found Red Hollow transformed once more, not by armies or riches, but by the spirit of unity. The town celebrated the day with feasts and prayers, honoring the man whose humble loaf of bread had bridged worlds. The soldiers who guarded his home were no longer strangers, but neighbors and friends. And through their shared stories, the community grew stronger, bound by the ties of kindness and respect. And so, Amos's journey continued, not as a tale of kings and soldiers alone, but as a living testament to the power of mercy. In every town where bread is broken, in every hand extended without question, his legacy rides on, a reminder that sometimes the simplest gifts carry the deepest power. Time continued its steady march, but the legend of Amos Clay only grew richer, woven into the stories of those who walked the dusty trails between settlements. Where once the West had been a land ruled by suspicion and solitude, Amos's example stirred a transformation. More towns began to open their doors to strangers. More hands reached out to help without waiting for repayment. It was as if his humble loaf had seeded an invisible network of kindness that stretched across vast deserts and rugged mountains. A traveling bard composed a ballad in Amos's honor, telling of the nameless man, the loaf of bread, and the 200 soldiers who came to guard a home that had become a sanctuary. The song was sung in saloons and around campfires, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, a single act of generosity could change the course of history. Strangers who heard the tale carried it to their own homes, passing it like a sacred flame from one generation to the next. But Amos never sought fame or fortune. Even as the soldiers stood watch, he remained grounded in the simple rhythms of daily life. He tended his small garden, shared meals with neighbors, and listened to the stories of travelers who stopped by his door. His life was a quiet testament that greatness is not measured by grandeur, but by the depth of one's compassion. In a world often deafened by noise and ambition, Amos's silence spoke volumes. In one final act of humility, Amos used the soldiers' protection not for himself, but to build a shelter for the town's most vulnerable, a place where the hungry could find bread, the weary could rest, and the forgotten could be remembered. The shelter was named the Bread House, a tribute not just to the food shared, but to the spirit that had kindled it. It became a beacon of hope, welcoming all who sought refuge from the unforgiving West. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over Red Hollow, the townsfolk gathered beneath the stars, their faces lit by firelight. They spoke of Amos not as a distant hero, but as one of their own, a man who had taught them that true power lies in the courage to give, even when you have little left to offer. And in their voices, his legacy lived on, a timeless reminder that sometimes a loaf of bread can be worth more than gold. The years that followed saw Red Hollow flourish in ways no one could have imagined. What had once been a quiet, overlooked settlement became a symbol of resilience and generosity. Visitors came from far and wide, drawn by the stories of the man who gave bread to a stranger and earned the protection of kings. They came to see the shelter, to meet the people shaped by Amos's example, and to carry home a piece of that kindness. Amos himself faded into the fabric of the town, his presence felt in every act of goodwill, every shared meal, every hand extended in help. He was no longer just a man. He was an idea, a standard, a promise that even in the most unforgiving places, humanity can shine brightest. And though his footsteps grew faint, the path he had carved remained clear and inviting. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the wind whispered through the sagebrush and the stars still held their watch, some claimed to hear the soft sound of hooves, steady and sure, like a man riding home. Whether it was Amos or the spirit of his generosity, no one could say. But for those who listened, it was a reminder that the greatest journeys begin with a single act of giving. And so, the story of Amos Clay lives on, not in books or monuments, but in the hearts of those who dare to share, who choose compassion over fear, and who understand that sometimes the simplest gifts are the most powerful. A loaf of bread, given without question, can change not just one life, but the destiny of many. In a world defined by dust, danger, and survival, Amos Clay's story reminds us that true strength lies not in power or possessions, but in the courage to give when it costs us the most. A simple loaf of bread, offered without hesitation to a man with no name, transformed a life, and in doing so, changed the course of an entire kingdom. It is a testament to the quiet, unassuming acts of kindness that ripple far beyond their origin, touching lives in ways we may never fully see. Amos's journey teaches us that greatness does not demand grandeur. It asks only for humanity, the willingness to recognize another's need and to respond with compassion. His legacy is not just guarded by soldiers or told in stories. It lives in every hand that reaches out to help, every meal shared without expectation, and every moment when we choose empathy over fear. In these choices, the spirit of Amos Clay endures. The question this story leaves us with is profound. What would you give when you have nothing left? In a world often consumed by taking, Amos's example challenges us to be givers. Even when the stakes are high, even when recognition is absent, it invites us to become the unseen heroes of our own communities, the silent guardians of hope and grace. So, as this tale settles in your heart, remember that your smallest act of kindness could echo in ways you never imagined. You may never meet a king or be guarded by soldiers, but you can offer a loaf of bread, a helping hand, or simply a moment of mercy to someone in need. That is the power each of us holds, the power to change the world, one gift at a time. If this story moved you, join us on this journey of discovery and compassion. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories that remind us of the strength and kindness. Like this video if Amos's courage inspired you, and share in the comments. What would you give when the world asks for everything? Your voice could be the spark that lights someone else's way.